Welcome to Autism Knows No Borders, a podcast where people connected to autism inspire change and build community. Together with the Global Autism Project, I'm your host, Rachel Harmon, a professional with over a decade of experience in the field of autism services, outreach, and advocacy. How do you regulate your emotions? Whether you're autistic or not, if you're curious about practical strategies for emotional regulation, you'll want to listen to this episode with Dr. Barry Prizant. Dr. Prizant is a speech-language pathologist, clinical scholar, consultant, and researcher. He co-developed the SCERTS Model, SCERTS standing for social communication, emotional regulation, and transactional support. This framework is designed to support individuals of all ages who experience or are at risk for social communicative and emotional regulatory difficulties. Dr. Prizant's book, Uniquely Human, A Different Way of Seeing Autism, has been the best-selling book on autism since 2015. Barry also co-hosts Uniquely Human, the podcast. This episode is part one of our conversation, and we discuss historical misconceptions about autism, the impact of social media on the neurodiversity movement, Gestalt language processing, and echolalia, which is the involuntary repetition of words and sounds spoken by another person, why emotional regulation is central to development, how the SCERTS model is different from more traditional intervention approaches, and practical emotional regulation techniques that you can apply today. In this episode, discover what's possible when you learn to regulate and you regulate to learn. And now I present you Dr. Barry Prizant.
Hi, I'm Dr. Barry Prizant. I'm a speech-language pathologist, and I am a researcher and clinician as well. And I have been involved in supporting people on the autism spectrum for more than half a century, starting out as a teenager, working in summer camps. And since that time, I have worked in hospitals, university settings, and certainly consulting for many, many years to schools and to hospitals and other agencies.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here. And, with all of your decades of experience in the field, could you kind of paint us a picture of what the understanding of autism was like when you first started? What did professionals misunderstand about autism back then?
Oh, goodness. Yes, there was a lot of misunderstanding, and it really depends upon who you spoke to at the time. People used to say, oh, he speaks, he can't be autistic, because people were thinking about the most impacted segment of the autism population. And other people were saying that he doesn't speak, he can't be autistic. In other words, people had almost their own views of what autism was because there was so little literature out there and so little understanding at all. And of course, that impacted families to a great extent because it was thought that if a child showed any affection towards a parent, that they couldn't be autistic, which we know is not the case. I mean, there were so many myths. Another one that has really turned around is that a lot of people felt that if a child, or at that time it was mostly children, had a negative reaction to a sensory experience, such as noise being too loud or being touched too quickly, the way they reacted were just behavior problems that needed to be controlled. So right now, I think one of the best changes that have happened is we understand that we're talking about a neurodevelopmental condition. Way back when, some people thought that, especially in psychiatry, thought that bad parenting caused autism, if you want to talk about the etiologies or the causes. So there have been dramatic changes. And of course, in my opinion, one of the greatest changes has been that autistic people now speak out about what their experience is like, what their experience was like in school when they were children, what their experience is like as adults. And something I believe we could probably talk a little bit more about is how the whole neurodiversity movement has impacted autism,
Mm-hmm.
understanding that brain differences lead to a different way of experiencing the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think, with the help of social media, also kind of amplifying those voices and really giving them a platform to speak up in, some safe spaces where that they know they might not be judged, and they feel a sense of community and get some validation with other people who are going through what they're going through. It really opens it up for professionals and family members who want to help them.
Huge. Social media is huge for not only helping the non-autistic population of people understanding autism more, but for ways for autistic people to connect with each other
Yeah.
and develop communities. And as you know, I do a podcast, and my co-host is autistic, and we've had probably around 80 autistic and neurodivergent guests on over the last few years. And I've learned so much, not just from my podcast, but listening to other podcasts and listening to what autistic people say online. As I mentioned, I've been around quite a long time, and I would say I definitely have learned more from autistic people than I have from decades of research done primarily by non-autistic people. But now there's much, much more of a movement for autistic people to be directly involved in research that impacts them.
Yeah. Amazing. So, in your experience, were there any specific instances with autistic individuals that kind of reshaped your thinking about autism?
Yeah. First of all, let me make it clear that even though I'm a speech and language pathologist and a psycholinguist, and I'm a specialist in language and communication, I've learned so much from just spending time and being around autistic people going way back to when I started in the field. And I could say probably my early experiences at summer camps, where I was living and responsible for the care and the happiness and the well-being. And these were residential summer camps, something that's very common in the US, where kids go away from their families to usually, hopefully, a very nice setting in the country and have swimming and all kinds of activities. Well, I was exposed to that initially in 1969, 1970. So I was living with people with various disabilities, many of whom were autistic, many of whom were not diagnosed as autistic at the time, and got a little bit of a feeling of what families and parents were experiencing. Not 12 months, 24/7, but 24/7 for a few months each year. And I did that for 6 years. And that led actually to my choosing to go into the field. And again, we could do a deeper dive into this, but my doctoral dissertation was one of the first videotape analyses of autistic kids and looking at their communication and behavior. And that was on echolalia, or the tendency to repeat speech. And at the time, it was thought in the field that echolalia was just meaningless parroting, these are quotes, or psychotic speech. And through following 4 children over 12 months, videotaping them at home, at school, with me, with their teachers, I was able to prove that echolalia very often served important functions in communication and probably was a part of the children's language development. Some people over the last 15 years have really picked up on my early work, hard to believe from 50 years ago. And this is now falls under the category of Gestalt language processing and Gestalt language. So right away, the autistic kids whose videos I analyzed and who I knew really well, because I was their speech and language pathologist, taught me to always question the literature.
Mm,
And it taught me to trust not only my judgment, but the parents. The parents said to me, "Oh, I think he's trying to communicate when he repeats speech, or it's an important part of his language development." Yet the research at that time was almost uniformly saying this is something to be discouraged or even punished.
yeah. Hey, Rachel here. Are you enjoying this episode? Want to hear more valuable content from others you can relate with? Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you can stay up to date on future episodes. And now back to the conversation. Yeah, and I remember in my early days as a practitioner, I was, a behavior therapist before there was an RBT credential. And so I remember some of the programs that we were providing and we were teaching the kids were to reduce echolalia. Exactly what you're saying, because at that time, there was this kind of normalizing of autistic people and wanting them to kind of hide their autistic traits. And that echolalia was making them stand out in public. And for whatever reason, maybe parents were feeling ashamed, or maybe the kids were getting bullied in schools. And so if it was getting in the way of their learning, or, whatever the reason,
Mhm.
I remember specifically that among other kinds of goals that now people don't really target anymore for the better, with a shift away from this kind of normalizing. But that was definitely one that stood out to me as well.
Yeah, and my doctoral dissertation directly disproved and refuted the work of Lovaas, who was the grandfather of ABA, what we call traditional ABA,
Hmm.
where, basically working and supporting autistic children was all about increasing desirable behaviors and decreasing and extinguishing undesirable behaviors,
Yeah.
which led, in my opinion, and to the opinion of many people, unfortunately, to a dehumanizing, because kids were just reduced to cataloging and counting behaviors rather than trying to understand their experience. Because in very traditional behaviorism, it was not, and this comes directly from Skinner, it was not allowed to try to consider what a person was feeling, that anything was not observable in terms of the inner experience or the emotions or the fear or the sensory sensitivities. That was considered to be unscientific at the time. So we were not allowed to think about, how is this person feeling? Let's just look at the behavior. If it's not desirable, let's put contingencies in place to reduce it or get rid of it. Yep.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I'm glad to see that. I think the field, at least the field of ABA, is shifting from this kind of radical mindset. I know that there's still a long way to go.
There is. Yeah. And to the extent, and I'll be quite blunt, to the extent that even people who consider themselves behavioral therapists hang on to some of the traditional notions.
Yeah.
One of the things that's dismaying to me, and I come from a group of approaches that's called kind of relationship-based developmental approaches. As a matter of fact, there is a new organization called the Coalition for Relationship-Based and Developmental Approaches. That includes Stanley Greenspan's Floor Time. That includes the Play Project, developed by a developmental pediatrician, Richard Solomon. It includes a number of people, and our model called the SCERTS Model, and SCERTS is an acronym for social communication, emotional regulation, and transactional support. And so we've really emphasized, as everybody has, the communication piece. But something that we really added in the late 90s and since that time is the emotional regulation piece. In other
Yeah.
words, it's not our job to manage behavior. And a lot of people still use the term behavior management, behavior management. It is our job to help autistic children and adults develop the capacity to keep a well-regulated emotional and physiological state. And if you do that, then you don't see the so-called problematic and challenging behavior, or it's reduced to a much greater extent.
Hmm. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought this up. I was just about to transition to talking about your work with emotional regulation. So, can you give some practical strategies for parents or educators? Like, how can they respond when a child is dysregulated?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the way that we can respond depends upon our deep knowledge of the child and what is causing the dysregulation. So, some very obvious examples are, if a child is becoming dysregulated, screaming, dropping to the floor in a school cafeteria, it might be that it's just too noisy. So maybe if we feel the child can cope in and participate in the cafeteria with noise dampening headphones, as many kids do now, that could be a preventative regulation strategy. Some cafeterias, I'm sticking with this because of a few things we could problem solve here, have quiet tables off in the corner away from the noise. That's another thing. We
Hmm.
could teach kids to ask for breaks, that I need to take a break now, it's too noisy. Or we could ask the teachers in charge in the cafeteria to quiet everybody else down. In other words, change the activity or change the environment. So that's very much on a sensory level. Another big cause of dysregulation, and I always like to say these are causes of dysregulation for everybody, for us as well, but autistic people are much more vulnerable to these factors. So another cause of dysregulation is uncertainty, not knowing what you're going to do next, what's on your schedule, and then if there are sudden changes in very common routines, that could cause a lot of anxiety and dysregulation. So some people say, well, autistic people are so controlling, or they freak out when there's an unexpected change. And that's because they have a much greater need than most of us. We all need predictability in our lives, but autistic people crave that predictability. And I believe because so much of the world is unpredictable all the time, but they're much more sensitive to that. So we use visual schedules to help kids understand what is coming next. If there's going to be a change in a schedule, then we prepare them, okay? And very often sensory supports can be helpful. So one way we all regulate is, you know, chewing gum, manipulating squeeze balls or stress balls. Exercise is incredibly regulating. Taking a break and walking up and down the hallway in a school 3 or 4 times when a child is anxious. That can be regulating. So in our model, the SCERTS model, we actually have a sequenced number, and it's not prescriptive, meaning that this is what you have to do, but we talk about different levels of emotional regulation supports. So on a sensory level, it could be chewy snacks. For older kids, it could be chewing gum. I mean, that's why we all regulate very often to chew by chewing gum or crunchy snacks. So we can do that. We can exercise. For some kids, just jumping up and down, getting that input into their, it's called proprioceptive input, into their joints and their legs. Even a chair that allows them to rock, like I'm rocking right now, can be regulated. But then we go to higher levels. We give kids information that's regulating. Okay. So here's our schedule for the morning. You know, a parent can say that at home. We could say that in school. I give an example in my book, Uniquely Human, of a child whose quote unquote problem behavior was that in the afternoon at school, he would say, Mommy picking me up, because it would be the mom or the dad who would be doing that. And what we did was we would put a picture of mom or dad on his desk, and then on the schedule, indicate who would be picking them up or that child up. So it reduces uncertainty. So that's giving information to help a child regulate. Sometimes you do both, sensory input and regulation. So you give the child a squeeze ball or a chair where he could rock if he needs to rock. There are so many causes of dysregulation, and we need to, in some cases, make educated guesses. In some cases, kids could tell us what they're worried about or what they're scared about. And we want to address those issues at those levels. Now, ideally, at our highest level of supporting regulation is we want kids to know the options to stay well regulated. So if you have a child maybe who has more sophisticated language, and we know we're going into a noisy gymnasium at school or a noisy cafeteria, and we teach him or her, what could you do if it gets too noisy? And the child says, I could ask for a break and take a walk. I could put on my headphones. I could go to the quiet corner of the cafeteria. That's the fancy term for that is what we call the metacognitive level of regulating, where the child knows there are 3 or 4 things I could do to help me regulate. And not all kids are capable of functioning at that level because it does demand a higher level of cognition or understanding. But think about it, we do that all the time. The example I like to give is you're going for a job interview and you really want this job, but then you get in your car and you start driving to the agency and there's an accident and a big traffic jam. And you say, I'm never going to make it there on time. And that's going to be a negative for me getting this job. Right away, we go into this mode of problem solving. Oh, I could call them and let them know about the accident and why I'm late. I could get off at an earlier exit and take the streets rather than staying on this highway. Or we could think, oh, well, they sound like really nice people, so they will understand when I get there. So at this level, we all the time are problem solving to deal with challenging situations. And why do we do that? To decrease our anxiety.
Mhm.
So that's just an example of the various levels that we are doing.
Yeah, that makes sense because you want a sense of control of the situation, and so if you have an out, if you have a solution for the problem, then that will help kind of calm your nerves.
Exactly. And let me just add quickly that the solution to the problem of at least decreasing the anxiety and feeling better regulated could be something that a child or person does by themselves, and that's called self-regulation,
Mhm.
okay? Some kids, and we do this in our head, but some autistic kids will have little mantras and actually say out loud, "It's okay, don't worry, everything will be okay." We do that in our heads, but some autistic kids, especially those who use gestalt phrases or echolalic, may do that. Or if they need help from others, we call it mutual regulation. They can ask us for help. "Can I have a hug, please?" Okay. "Are we going swimming this afternoon?" If a child is anxious as to whether they're gonna do that activity. So in the SCERTS model, we have 2 sides of the coin. Self-regulation, what a child or a person can do by themselves, and mutual, some people call this co-regulation, what they could do by getting help from another person. And the most regulated human being, whether you're autistic or not, is when we have strategies to self-regulate, but we can seek out help from others when we need that help.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, that's important, especially when because we are such social creatures to begin with.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, with regards to the SERTS model, would you say that it's an approach that people apply, like, at home or at school, or is it a specific training that people can seek out, become credentialed in, or what like, how could people kind of gain this knowledge that you're talking about?
Yeah, we have, 2 of my colleagues. Let me just mention them quickly. Amy Laurent, really for many years was an occupational therapist, but now she has gone back and has a degree in special education and a doctorate in developmental psychology. So she's a special educator, occupational therapist, and a PhD level psychologist. Uh, and Emily Rubin, who was actually a student of mine years ago, and she's a speech-language pathologist. They do trainings online, and we have a Facebook group under the SCERTS model, SCERTS. All 3 of us do Zoom trainings and live trainings. I pretty much have moved primarily to the, introductory level, and they do the more advanced. There's a online educational company called MedBridge, MEDBRIDGE. They started out primarily by providing online medically oriented education for physical therapists, occupational therapists. They have, our course on the SCERTS model. So there are a number of different ways. Let me also mention specifically that Dr. Amy Laurent has a partner who is a PhD level autistic psychologist. Her name is Jacqueline Fady. She has just joined our search team as we are evolve and move forward. And the name of their business is Autism Level Up. And if you Google Autism Level Up, they have tons of free downloads and tons of free supports, especially around emotional regulation. Now, the question about credentialing, or some people speak of certification, we do not have a formal certification because what that requires is that we would be monitoring the people who are implementing the model.
Mhm.
The model is a framework, first of all, and we believe anybody who is a credentialed teacher, OT, PT, psychologist, with the proper training in the SCERTS model by all of the means that we've discussed, should be able to implement the SCERTS model. And we are all over the world right now.
Yeah, great. I love that it's accessible.
Yes.
Okay, and we'll be sure to, put some of those links in our show notes so that people can reach out.
Great.
Thanks for tuning in to Autism Knows No Borders. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and come back next Thursday for part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Barry Prizant, where he talks about why his book, Uniquely Human, is relatable across cultures. Thanks for listening. Take care.